There she is, the Duke of Denholt thought, and his heart did the quiet, hopeless thing it had done on every gathering for 8 years, and Adeline Crook, who had spent the evening arranging herself into the dimmest corner of the ballroom, never once suspected she was the most closely watched woman in the room. Demetrius stood at the edge of the crowd with a glass he did not drink, and he watched her do the thing she always did. She had chosen, as she always chose, the seat half hidden by the great marble pillar, where the candlelight thinned to grey. She had worn, as she always wore, a gown the precise colour of the wallpaper, a soft fawn that asked the eye to slide past it and find something brighter to admire. She had folded her hands, lowered her eyes, and made herself, by long and deliberate practice, invisible. She did not know that he could find her in any room in England with his eyes shut. He had loved her for 8 years. He could have named the date, the gathering, the very dance during which it had happened. Though they had not danced, he had been a younger man then, newly come into his title, and she had been a quiet girl of no particular fortune standing at the side of a country assembly, and someone had laughed at her plain gown, and she had not flinched. She had simply lifted her chin a fraction and let the cruelty pass over her like weather. And the Duke of Denholt, who had stood across that long-ago room watching, had felt something turn over in his chest that had never afterward turned back. He had said nothing. He had been saying nothing for 8 years. It was not cowardice, though he had often called himself a coward for it. It was a kind of arithmetic that had seemed, every time, to come out the same way. He was a duke, and she was a woman of small means who had made an art of being overlooked. If he crossed a crowded room to speak to her, every eye in the county would turn upon her at once, and the one thing in the world she could not bear, he had understood very early, was to be looked at. To declare himself would be to drag her into the glare she spent every evening fleeing. And so, year after year, he had loved her the only way he believed she could survive being loved, silently at a distance, asking nothing, taking nothing, content merely to know which corner of which room she had chosen to disappear into. He knew a great many things about her that she did not know he knew. He knew she pressed flowers. He had once seen her slip a sprig of violet from a table arrangement into her glove, and had spent a week absurdly happy about it. He knew she read. Her conversation, on the rare occasions he had managed to be near it, was quick and dry and ran far deeper than her plain gowns advertised. He knew she sat with the old and the unfashionable at dinners, because they were grateful for company and would not stare at her. He knew that under the careful grayness she had built around herself, there was a woman of warmth and wit and a quiet, stubborn courage, and he knew that almost no one else in the world had ever bothered to look hard enough to see it. He had bothered. He had done little else in 8 years, but look. It had become the secret architecture of his life, this looking. He arranged his seasons around the gatherings he knew she would attend. He refused invitations to grander houses for duller ones, if the duller ones had her name among the guests. There were nights he came home having exchanged no more than a dozen words with her, and counted the evening a triumph, because he had heard her laugh once at something an old dowager said, and carried the sound home with him, like a man carrying a single coal to keep a fire alive through a long winter. It was not a way to live, his sister had told him more than once. He knew it was not. He had not been able to stop. "You are doing it again," said his sister, appearing at his elbow with the particular briskness of a woman who has watched her brother be a fool for the better part of a decade, standing in the dark, gazing at the wallpaper. "People are beginning to think you have a fascination with interior decoration." "I am admiring the room," Demetrius said. "You are admiring Miss Crook, as you have admired her at every assembly since the year I came out, and as you will go on admiring her in perfect silence until you are both old and grey and is far too late." His sister sighed, and her voice softened from exasperation to something kinder. "Demetrius, she is not happy in that corner. I have watched her too. She is not hiding because she enjoys it. She is hiding because she has decided no one will ever come and find her, and so she has stopped letting herself hope that anyone might. A pause. How long do you mean to prove her right? The Duke of Denholt did not answer his sister, but the words went into him like a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut 8 years before. He looked at Adeline across the bright, noisy room, at the careful way she angled her chair, so the pillar hid her from the dancers, at the gown chosen to match the wall, and tried, perhaps for the first time, to see it not as the refuge he had always imagined, but as the thing his sister insisted it was. A woman did not labor so hard at being unseen unless being seen had taught her something cruel. Somewhere the world had looked at Adeline Crook and found her wanting, and she had believed it, and spent every evening since making certain the world need never look again. And he, who had loved her longer and more faithfully than any creature alive, had stood in the shadows season after season and confirmed the verdict with his silence. He had thought himself the exception to her loneliness. He was beginning to fear he had been its chief author. He had told himself all this time that his silence was a kindness, that he stayed away to spare her the glare. But what if his silence was the very thing that taught her, season after season, that she was a woman no one would ever cross a room for? What if the corner she fled to was not a refuge she wanted, but a cage she had been driven into, partly, by a man too careful with his own heart to risk her discomfort, even to offer her love? He set down his glass. He did not stride across the ballroom and declare himself before the assembled county. Even now, even moving at last, he would not do that to her. He went the long way round, through the quiet edges of the room where the candlelight thinned, the way she herself always went, so that he might arrive at her corner without 100 faces turning to follow him. And when he reached the shadow of the great marble pillar where Adeline Crook sat trying to be no one, he stopped and he said, very quietly, so that only she could hear, "Miss Crook, I have been trying to find the courage to speak to you for 8 years, and I have only just discovered that I left it rather late." Adeline looked up. For a moment she plainly thought he must be addressing someone behind her, and she half turned to see who. When she understood that there was no one behind her, that the Duke of Denholt, of all the men in England, had walked into her hidden corner and spoken her name, the colour rose in her face, and her hands tightened in her fawn-coloured lap. "Your Grace," she said, "I think you have mistaken me for—" "I have not mistaken you for anyone," he said gently. "You are Adeline Crook. You press violets into your glove when you think no one is watching. You sit with the old ladies because they will not stare. You have worn, this evening, a gown the exact colour of that wall, because you have spent 8 years teaching the world not to look at you." He drew a slow breath. "And I am the one man in every one of those rooms who has never once managed to look at anything else." The dry, quick wit that his sister had glimpsed, and he had cherished from afar, deserted Adeline entirely. She stared up at him, and her composure, the careful greyness, the practiced invisibility, wavered like a candle in a draught. "That is not possible," she whispered. "No one looks at me. I have made quite certain of it." "You have made certain that no one else does," Demetrius said. "You did not reckon on me." He glanced briefly at the bright crowded centre of the ballroom, then back to her shadowed corner, and his voice dropped lower still. "May I tell you a thing I have never told a living soul? I have loved you for 8 years, Miss Crook, since a country assembly where a foolish girl laughed at your gown and you did not flinch. I have loved you across 100 rooms and said nothing, because I told myself that to speak would be to expose you to the very thing you most dislike, every eye in the county turning upon you at once. I believed my silence was a kindness." He shook his head slowly. "It has just been pointed out to me that my silence may instead have been teaching you, all this while, that you were a woman no one would ever come to find. If that is so, then I have done you a far greater unkindness by my silence than I could ever have done by my speech, and I have come, 8 years too late, to undo it." Adeline Crook had spent the better part of her adult life perfecting the art of feeling nothing that showed. She felt a great many things now, and every one of them showed. 8 years, she said faintly. 8 years. You watched me hide in corners for 8 years, and you said nothing. To my lasting shame, yes. A sound escaped her that was half a laugh and half something perilously near a sob. Your Grace, do you have the faintest notion how many evenings I have sat in corners exactly like this one, telling myself it did not matter that no one came, that I preferred it, that I had chosen it? Her voice trembled. And do you know what I was doing, in fact, all those evenings? I was watching the room go by and wishing, just once, that someone would think me worth crossing it for, and telling myself no one ever would, and being right. For 8 years, being right. She pressed her gloved hand briefly to her mouth, and you were there, the whole time, you were there. I was there the whole time, Demetrius said. I am here now, and I do not intend to be anywhere else for the rest of my life, if you will permit it. From his breast pocket he drew something small and worn, and held it out to her on his open palm, there in the shadow of the pillar, where no one in the bright room could see. It was a dance card, old, the paper gone soft at the edges with handling, the year upon it 8 seasons past. You will not remember this, he said. There was an assembly, the first winter I knew your face, and the cards were given out, and you were never asked to dance. They overlooked you, as they always overlooked you, and you sat at the side with your empty card, and bore it the way you bear everything, without complaint. I took the card from the table after you had gone. I have kept it 8 years. His voice was not quite steady. I have spent 8 years promising the empty spaces on this card that if I were ever brave enough to ask, I would fill them all myself. Adeline looked at the soft-worn card on his palm, at the 8 years of silent devotion written in the very wear of its edges, and the last of the careful greyness fell away from her entirely. Then ask, she said. The Duke of Denholt, who had loved her in silence through 8 long years, 100 ballrooms, and 10,000 glances she never caught, set the worn card in her hand, and closed her gloved fingers over it with both of his, and asked, Will you dance with me, Miss Crook, now in the centre of the room, where everyone can see, not because I wish them to look at you, but because I have spent 8 years letting you believe you were invisible, and I find I cannot bear to let you believe it for one moment longer. Let them look. Let the whole county look. I should like, at last, for everyone to see precisely what I have seen all along. For a long moment Adeline did not move, and the old terror of the glare rose up in her, the deep practiced instinct to slide back into the wallpaper and disappear. Then she looked at the man before her, at the signet ring on the hand that held hers, at the worn card of 8 faithful years, at the dark steady eyes that had, it seemed, never truly looked at anyone but her, and she found that she was not afraid of the glare after all. Not with him standing between her and it, not with 8 years of proof folded in her fist. Yes, Adeline said, and rose, and stepped out of her corner for the first time in her life. Yes, Your Grace, I will dance with you, and they may look all they like. He led her out of the shadow of the pillar and into the bright candlelit centre of the floor, and the county did look, of course it looked. The great and untouchable Duke of Denholt was leading out the wallflower in the wallpaper gown, and there was not a fan in the room that did not pause. But Adeline, who had dreaded that gaze her whole life, found that under the steady shelter of his arm it did not frighten her at all. She held her chin level, the way she had once held under cruelty in a country assembly 8 years before. Only now there was no cruelty in the room, only astonishment, and behind the astonishment, slowly, something like delight. You are not hiding, Demetrius murmured as the music took them. No, Adeline said. I find I no longer wish to. When the dance ended he did not return her to her corner. That chair had ceased, in the space of one waltz, to have anything to do with the woman on his arm. He led her instead to his sister, who took both Adeline's hands and said only, I am so very glad. I have wanted a sister these 8 years, and I could never make him fetch one." And Adeline, who had not been claimed by anyone in longer than she could remember, found her careful composure quite undone, in the very best of ways. He called the very next day openly, his carriage at her door for all the street to see. And the courtship that followed was the gentlest the county had ever witnessed. A duke who had waited 8 years was in no hurry now to do anything but cherish, and a woman who had spent 8 years making herself small began, slowly, under the warmth of being at last truly seen, to unfold. He pressed violets for her now, since he knew she loved them, and brought them to her himself, and watched her face each time as though the bringing of a flower were a privilege he could scarcely believe he had been granted. He had studied her in silence for 8 years. Now he studied her openly and found, to his joy, that being permitted to look was 1,000 times sweeter than the long secret looking had ever been. She wore, on the day they married, a gown of soft blue silk did not match any wall in England, and she did not for one moment try to disappear into the crowd, because there was no longer any crowd in the world that frightened her with him beside her. In the long happy years that followed, the worn old dance card hung framed in a quiet corner of the Duke of Denholt's study, where most visitors never noticed it. But Adeline noticed it every day. And on the evenings when the old habit stirred in her, the small ancient instinct to make herself unseen, she had only to glance at it to remember the truest thing she knew, that for 8 silent years, in every crowded room she had ever tried to vanish from, there'd been one man who had never once stopped looking for her, and who, when at last he found the courage to cross the room, had never afterward let her out of his sight.